So greetings again. We meet under the arches of the life divine to look at its collected insights in every avenue of existence and life. It's called the life divine because it aims at something greater than the terrestrial life that we all enjoy currently. It is known as Sri Aurobindo's magnum opus, his greatest work in prose. It is regarded as a philosophic milestone, but I would say that we regard it as something more than academic philosophy. It really is a record of his inner spiritual experiences placed into a rational framework that the mind of humanity can appreciate and use as a guidebook, actually, in plotting out its advance, noting its achievements, its limitations, and its infinite possibilities. So Sri Aurobindo, apart from what he said in The Life Divine and in the Aria and its prospectus as it was getting ready for publication, noted a few things about philosophy. There was a statement presented to him. Sri Aurobindo's intellect was influenced by Greek philosophy. He responded, very little. I read more than once Plato's Republic and Symposium, but only extracts from his other writings. It is true that under his impress, I rashly started writing at the age of 18 an explanation of the cosmos on the foundation of the principle of beauty and harmony. But it never got beyond the first 3 or 4 chapters. I read Epictetus and was interested in the ideas of the Stoics and the Epicureans, but I made no study of Greek philosophy. I made, in fact, no study of metaphysics in my school and college days. What little I knew about philosophy, I picked up desultorily in my general reading. I once read not Hegel, but a small book on Hegel, but it left no impression on me. Later in India, I read a book on Bergson, but that too ran off, quote, like water from a duck's back, end quote. I remembered very little of what I had read and absorbed nothing. German metaphysics and most European philosophy since the Greeks seemed to me a mass of abstractions with nothing concrete or real that could be firmly grasped and written in a metaphysical jargon to which I had not the key. I tried once a translation of Kant, but dropped it after the first 2 pages and never tried again. In India, at Baroda, I read a tractate of Schopenhauer on the 6 centers, and that seemed to me more interesting. In sum, my interest in metaphysics was almost null, and in general philosophy, sporadic. I did not read Berkeley and only perhaps glanced into Hume. Locke left me very cold. Some general ideas only remained with me. As to Indian philosophy, it was a little better, but not much. I made no study of it, but knew the general ideas of the Vedanta philosophies. I knew practically nothing of the others except what I had read in Max Mueller and in other general accounts. The basic idea of the self caught me when I was in England. I tried to realize what the self might be. The first Indian writings that took hold of me were the Upanishads, and these raised in me a strong enthusiasm, and I tried later to translate some of them. The other strong intellectual influence that came in India in early life were the sayings of Ramakrishna and the writings and speeches of Vivekananda. But this was a first introduction to Indian spiritual experience and not as philosophy. They did not, however, carry me to the practice of yoga. Their influence was purely mental. He was talking there about Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. My philosophy was formed first by the study of the Upanishads and the Gita. The Veda came later. They were the basis of my first practice of yoga. I tried to realize what I read in my spiritual experience and succeeded. In fact, I was never satisfied till experience came, and it was on this experience that later on I founded my philosophy, not on ideas by themselves. I owed nothing in my philosophy to intellectual abstractions, ratiocination, or dialectics. When I have used these means, it was simply to explain my philosophy and justify it to the intellect of others. The other source of my philosophy was the knowledge that flowed from above when I sat in meditation, especially from the plane of the higher mind. When I reached that level, the ideas from the higher mind, came down in a mighty flood, which swelled into a sea of direct knowledge, always translating itself into experience, or they were intuitions starting from an experience and leading to other intuitions and a corresponding experience. This source was exceedingly Catholic and many-sided, and all sorts of ideas came in which might have belonged to conflicting philosophies, but they were here reconciled in a large synthetic whole. So can we see in his own words how little he owed to the philosophies of India in terms of deep study. We can see that in his library, though, prior to, let's say, 1932, that there were a number of philosophic books there. He had, for instance, a number of Shankara's works in Sanskrit, and he read them in Sanskrit and knew their arguments pretty well, which you can see in his assessment of Advaita Vedanta in the pages of the Life Divine. He did not agree with Shankara, but he understood. So, if we're going to regard this book as his statement in philosophical language, well, it's not wrong, but we know where the limits are now. The branches of philosophy in the classical sense are manifold. There's epistemology, the study of knowledge. There's ethics. How do we behave properly? Logic. What leads to correct conclusions in a train of argument? And metaphysics, of course. And within metaphysics is the study of ontology, the nature of being. being in all of its aspects. And that's where we're beginning. Now, in medieval Latin, we went to the term esse, E-S-S-E, and the original Greek, which was used by Plato and Aristotle, was ousia, O-U-S-I-A, getting to the essence of things, what is behind the appearance of the reality that we apprehend with our senses and with our intellect. So there's something deeper, something real that all philosophers are trying to gain access to, sometimes through ratiocination, a logical process that begins with a thesis and ends with a conclusion. Most often that is not correct. An analysis of the substance of nature is another way to measure what is real. But for Sri Aurobindo, this question of what is real and what is not goes back to the very bases of Vedanta. There are three great Vedantic texts. In ancient India, Vedanta means the end of the Veda, so we would be referring here to the Upanishads. And the first, of course, is not only an Upanishad, it is also an Aranyaka, and so a forest treatise. That's the Brihad Aranyaka. The second is the Chandogya Upanishad. And the third is the Taittiriya Upanishad. And you'll remember we spent a good deal of time going through all the verses of the Taittiriya. Sri Aurobindo found it key to his view of the cosmos, yet he never had a chance to really extend commentary to the Taittiriya as he had to the Isha and as he did to the Kena. Of course, let's note that when he offered a perspective of what the Arya would be to potential readership, he noted that he would put forward a philosophy pinned to the Isha Upanishad. He had already written a monograph called The Life Divine about the teaching of the Isha. It's fewer than 20 verses, and one could expand upon the deep meaning there. But when he got to the Arya, he set that aside, wrote a preliminary essay, and set that aside. And as you'll remember, then wrote probably the most memorable 4 pages in all of philosophy in 1914 when we saw his opening chapter, The Human Aspiration. We're not starting with that chapter. We're going to look at this question of being. And we will probably spend more than one, perhaps several evenings looking at this material. So what is real and what is not? What is the essence of being? To go behind the appearance to something that is fundamental, to something that is elemental, to something that is essential. It might be the aspiration of philosophers. For Sri Aurobindo, it was the aspiration of his soul. And in his first efforts in 1908 at the practice of yoga, he penetrated or was penetrated, overwhelmed, awash in the experience of nirvana, which made all of existence seem phantasmagorial. All the phenomenal world was thin. That was real. It had no name. but it was not a void. Ego disappeared into it, but it was an unspeakable reality and something that existed behind any expressed content or form or state of reality. This experience, as you'll remember, was supplemented, greatened within a year with a more tremendous experience where the reality that he knew as sort of the dark side of Brahman, if you will, became a living, omnipresent being whose light lit up everything, whose felt presence was in all things material, vital, intellectual, that every form was throbbing with the divine presence, which he called Vasudeva. This was a still greater experience, he felt, than the first that he had. But one did not negate the other. The reality of the cosmos was conjoined to the abstract nature of this thing that escapes all definition. So the isness of things, the essence of being, hidden or overt, has no boundaries and is immeasurable by mental concepts or by physical instruments. So we speak about his philosophy, but it's poor language. Really, his thought system is based upon his direct experience, spiritual and psychological. He called these leading essays in the Arya, the Life Divine, and later, as you know, he collected them all, revised them, and then added a number of chapters, divided the whole book into two. Part one, the omnipresent reality, and then a second part as well. We're going to be looking mostly at this first book in these initial talks as we gather around the Life Divine. Having summarized it, now we're going to look at a number of themes that appear within the Life Divine, and being ought to be the first. So if you look at an early chapter, Reality Omnipresent, you'll see that he opens with a citation from the Taittiriya Upanishad, which you'll remember we read together, and not from the oldest of the Upanishads, the Aranyaka. That one opens in its second verse with, "There was nothing whatsoever here in the beginning. By death, mrityu, indeed was this covered, or by hunger. For hunger is death." So this idea that the beginning of things is really from an unmet need, and that death is the first form that being takes coming out of non-being, is interesting indeed for those of you who have been close readers of Sri Aurobindo's epic poem Savitri. You'll remember that when Savitri, and I don't want to be a spoiler here, but when Savitri confronts and defeats death in the end, death is eaten by light. And then, as she surveys still higher worlds, she meets that same form and recognizes that indeed death was a form of this Godhead whom now she stands before. So this idea of death leading to that greater divine reality, that supreme pinnacle of being, is in the Brihad Aranyaka and it's in Sapatri as well. But he continues later to cite other passages from the Upanishads. So if that's the first in Brihad Aranyaka, the next oldest is the Chandogya. And here in the sixth chapter, second part, verses 1 and 2, the Upanishad says, "In the beginning, my dear, this was being alone, one only without a second. Some people say, in the beginning, this was non-being alone, one only without a second. Ekam evadityam. From that non-being, being was produced. But how, indeed, my dear, could it be thus? How could being be produced from non-being? On the contrary, my dear, in the beginning, this was being alone, one only, without a second." So this takes the opposite view. If you look at the superficial statement in the Brihad Aranyaka, it says non-being leads to being. Death leads to being. But what would it really mean? To Sri Aurobindo, that's an inadequate description. What non-being, asat, means there is that whatever that unknowable is, it escapes and transcends and has freedom even from positive definition. It's not that it's a void, it's that you cannot describe it even in positive terms. Sri Aurobindo accepts it in that sense. Not that there is an original void. And in fact, he surmises this might have been Buddha's original teaching. It's pretty clear that no, Buddha really meant that there was a shunya, but a void. But it's still possible that Buddha really was trying to take us out of identification with the particular and into an experience in nirvana where what cannot be described or defined was the substance of our consciousness then. Being or not, whether there's being or not, what might be there. So, if we move from Brihad Aranyaka and the Chandogya, you have this fundamental disagreement. We come to the Taittiriya Upanishad, which is the third oldest. Huh? But it says, in a sense, agreeing with both of the others, it says, if one knows him as Brahman, the non-being, asat, he becomes merely the non-existent. If one knows that Brahman is esse, sat, then he is known as the real in existence. In the beginning, all this was the non-being. It was thence that being was born. So the Taittiriya is saying, depending on your consciousness and your relative position, you will see it as a void, as non-being, a sat, or you will see it as real being. But being is real and it comes out of something that exceeds being. Again, does not identify it with the shunya. That idea comes many centuries or at least several centuries later. This is not an idea native to Vedanta. And we're talking here about the foundations of Vedanta. Sri Aurobindo, as we've just read, pinned his whole philosophy on the Upanishads, on Vedantic sources, the end of the Veda, the end of the books of knowledge. So, however it is, Brihadaranyaka, Chandogya, and Taittiriya go on next to describe a universe which is very real. There is no question about the reality of the universe. The cosmos is fashioned by being with its vast stretches, its depths, its peoples, its cosmic principles. Everything is real. And what do they call it most often? Brahman. From that root, we go to it again. Br, B-R with a dot under it, H, which means that which expands, that which grows, that which becomes more and more powerful. This is not an isolate. This is not an abstract essence that does nothing but just sits there like homogenized milk. No, this is something that's powerful, that moves, and it moves in cosmic form. But it also, asat, exceeds cosmic form. Brahman denotes reality to us. So what is it that would be part of this Brahman? If the universe is real and created of it, and all the peoples who pursue it, who idealize it, are aspects of it, who in fact make poems about it, which every one of these utterances is called a Brahman, a mantra, describing what is real, then what do we do with this? Because there is a mutual comprehension of all these elements of existence. We may be confused. We may find it fundamentally incomprehensible, but there is a oneness inside this being which unites them all. It doesn't even have to make an effort to unite it. Union, unity, oneness is natural to Brahman. If we've lost that, then that's a clue to us for something we can work on. So enlarged, being must unite matter and spirit, for instance. It must reconcile seeming opposites, consciousness, insentience, delight, suffering. All things must be held within a common reality. And to find that is the goal not only of the philosopher, but to Sri Aurobindo, the mystic, the knower, the one who pursues vision. So oneness and multiplicity, silence of the Brahman, the Shunya of Buddha, and activity, the Karma Yoga of Krishna, all are reconciled in the essential embrace of real being, of Sat. Asat, then, non-being, must mean what is beyond positive conception. The zero is the all, or an indefinable infinite. Sat and asat permit each other, but do not mingle to the mind's view. In the mystic view, they are one, the obverse and reverse of the same divine coin. The unknowable, beyond the mind's ken, K-E-N, realizes and affirms itself as pure being, Sat. That is its first stance. The unknowable becomes Sat. And obviously, you're quite familiar with this. Sat does not sit alone. There is not sheer existence, unknowing, dumbfounded by its own nature. No, it is aware. It is conscious. It is chit. And this infinite existence, whose nature is consciousness, or this consciousness which is founded in being, has as its leading character, its inlook is delight. Its experience as it expresses itself is free joy. It is unbridled bliss. As it is above, Sat Chit Ananda, the three are one, and yet we experience them and cognize them here relationally. We think of existence as being conscious. We think of delight as being an expression of fulfilled being, etc. All of these are true, but in itself, Sat Chit Ananda is one. Triune is the word that we use to express it. This Satchit Ananda is not a concept that occurs in the earliest Upanishads, which we've looked at. We saw that it got close in the Taittiriya, even it described the worlds, the various planes from matter, life, mind to supermind, and then beyond to Ananda. It was getting close to a cosmic view very similar to Sri Aurobindo's. But the term Satchit Ananda does not occur then. And if that's, let's say, 600, 700 BCE, it takes it a full 1,000 years to get articulated into philosophies. And then they are no longer the Vedantic forms that we knew in the past. They have become theistic Vedantic philosophies and schools then. So we meet this topic first, this concept first in the Muktika Upanishad, in the Vasudeva, verse 3, and in the Rama Uttara Tapani in verses 2 and 5. And then, of course, it sweeps in through the rest of Vedanta after the 4th century, all the way through. Curiously, of course, Shankara never touches it, so far as I'm aware. He abjured connection to it because that would be to diminish the oneness, the absolute oneness, the monism of what Brahman is. So he could not probably have accepted it. But all of these isms, Shankara's Advaita monism, Ramanuja's qualified monism, as they say it, or you might say differentiated, differentiated oneness, and Madhvacharya's Dvaita, which means dualistic school, all three of them are subsumed in the whole view of Vedanta. And for Sri Aurobindo, it is the widest possible conception of the human mind that is an antechamber to what is the mystic experience that unites them all. So Sri Aurobindo goes a step farther as well and draws into our view the tantric fields. Of course, he only knew what had been published in the early 20th century, a lot of it under John Woodruff's supervision. And there were greater tantric texts that would be discovered in subsequent decades that he would have been delighted to see because they affirmed and allied with his own philosophy. That beauty, that joy is an intended aspect of the divine manifestation, which should flower in time, should be part of the self-revelation of divine being. So, Abhinavagupta, of course, is a great exponent for the Trika philosophy from Kashmir. Sri Aurobindo was never acquainted with it. But just to note a thing or two about the different poles of being, we affirm that there is a reality behind the silence, that the Atman can be realized as a sheer existence, as Brahman, apart from the phenomenal world. And also we can affirm that there is a silence beyond this silence. There is an experience of nirvana, which is consistent with desireless and effective action. That realization need not abolish the world. One can live in that free consciousness without subordinating, diminishing, rejecting the world. And in fact, if you look at the Buddha and his life, after his enlightenment, he spent the rest of his life in service to humanity, trying to relieve them of unnecessary suffering. Because the reason they suffered was that they were identified with fictional aspects of what they thought they were. Get to what you really are, you are free. You experience nirvana. And of course, do we need to mention Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, who insisted that one could work and grow into conscious union with the Supreme Person and transcend the apparent dualities of the world while consigning all action to the divine, making everything an offering. So if what Krishna affirmed can be reconciled in the experience of what Buddha offered, then we have some denotation that this is a practicable goal. We can do this. Brahman, in its immitigable freedom, freedom that cannot be mitigated, is an omnipresent reality. From the top to the bottom, behind, around, all that is that. And it is not a cause of illusion. So Sri Aurobindo is a realist in his philosophy, and there is a positive basis in being to harmonize all possible conceptions which occur in the human imagination. I'd like to read just a small section from a chapter called Reality Omnipresent. This is on page 35. The unknowable is something to us supreme, wonderful, and ineffable, which continually formulates itself to our consciousness and continually escapes from the formulation it has made. This it does, not as some malicious spirit or freakish magician leading us from falsehood to greater falsehood, and so to a final negation of all things. But as even here, the wise, beyond our wisdom, guiding us from reality to ever profounder and vaster reality, until we find the profoundest and vastest of which we are capable. An omnipresent reality is the Brahman, not an omnipresent cause of persistent illusions. If we thus accept a positive basis for our harmony, and on what other can harmony be founded, the various conceptual formulations of the unknowable, each of them representing a truth beyond conception, must be understood as far as possible in their relation to each other and in their effect upon life, not separately, not exclusively, not so affirmed as to destroy or unduly diminish all other affirmations. So continue reading from that. So this being is here, and it can't be here accidentally. Something consciously wills to manifest, even in the apparent oppositions. And it does so not from incapacity, not from impotence. The divine being has invested itself here with a purpose. And as non-being is not really nullity, cosmic being is not a hallucination. The phenomenal substantiates truth information. Give it a chance. Let it have its evolutionary goals get realized, and you'll see. Highest experience reveals that being in cosmos is a conscious existent whose nature is bliss. Back we go to Satchit Ananda. And beyond the cosmos, Satchit Ananda remains unknowably blissful. Again, we conceive of it relationally. It conceives of itself unitively. In fact, as it conceives of itself, it becomes supramental. That is the instrumentalizing nature of Satchit Ananda at its highest point, at supramental existence's highest point. So, how do we do it? How do we tie it all together? We have to evolve it. We have to develop a step at a time. We have to develop our knowledge into more perceptive and deep and high levels. We have to get out of the superficies of existence and into the deep waters. And that journey has to be supported by faith, our confidence in ourselves that we, born from that, have it innate in us to repeat the journey to find the path by which we arrived here that takes us back. That our involution into apparent darkness means that we can reverse that and manifest an evolution into light. So our loss of status of being is not real, and even its form is only temporary. So for Sri Aurobindo, this path to the life divine is an affirmative path in which knowledge, bolstered by faith, arrives at wisdom. What is real above the cosmos and also real in the cosmos must also be real in the individual. Back to these three poises of a single being. And since all expresses Satchit Ananda, the individual must contain within, in seed, all that connotes. In this, Sri Aurobindo agrees with Ramanuja, differentiated oneness Vedantic philosopher, 11th to 13th century, somewhere in there. Our individual status as souls is inseparable from the Supreme Person. Always we are a portion, an ansha of that. Always, if that is a solar light, we are a radiation of it. So these three poises of a real being, the transcendent beyond expression, the universal pervading and informing the cosmos, and the individual in capturing in a small bright seed what these larger terms define. These three, we are at once, because we are not merely the individual, we also have universal suggestions in us. We also hail from something that is transcendent. And so the form is mortal, mitigable, but the spirit inside is ever free, eternal, and infinite in its compass. The transcendent can't be fully expressed. It transcends. Yet the cosmic grades of being, marrying spirit above to matter below, can be experienced, and in fact are experienced as we evolve and we recapture ground that we lost on our way down as we climb back up. And this can be experienced, and we can station ourselves at each and all of these levels successfully by any soul willing to evolve. We don't insist. The divine does not pressure you if you don't want to evolve and simply want to back out of the universe. That's a free way to go. It is up to you as an individual soul in relationship to the Supreme to make that decision. But in psychological fact, the individual can unite through personal achievement, the dark below with the bright above, and harmonize all the states of being possible to us in perfected form, and not simply individually, but in a collective life. So Sri Aurobindo's largest vision is a statement of truth. We can do this if we will to do it. And that suggests that a divine life is possible. How we make it real, again, that's through effortful growth into profound communion that empowers our transformation of all the links in the great chain of being. We have to be omnipresently placed. We have to be able to live in accord harmonically with all points in the cosmos, seen, unseen, centered in ourselves. The fiery revelation of these hidden powers dawns in us and sits in us. Will we recognize it? So I think it is far enough for our first evening on being. We'll try to continue to be Next time. We won't take the choice not to be. Let me read from Savitri. And since we've mentioned dawn, I think you might agree with me that the first page of Savitri is the best to begin with. So we go to Canto 1 in Book 1, the Book of Beginnings. This canto is called The Symbol Dawn. It was the hour before the gods awake. Across the path of the divine event, the huge foreboding mind of night alone in her unlit temple of eternity lay stretched immobile upon silence marge. Almost one felt opaque, impenetrable, in the somber symbol of her eyeless muse, the abysm of the unbodied infinite. A fathomless zero occupied the world. A power of fallen boundless self awake between the first and the last nothingness, recalling the tenebrous womb from which it came, turned from the insoluble mystery of birth and the tardy process of mortality, and longed to reach its end in vacant naught. As in a dark beginning of all things, a mute, featureless semblance of the unknown, repeating forever the unconscious act, prolonging forever the unseeing will, cradled the cosmic drowse of ignorant force, whose moved creative slumber kindles the suns and carries our lives in its somnambulist whirl. Athwart the vain, enormous trance of space, its formless stupor without mind or life, a shadow spinning through a soulless void, thrown back once more into unthinking dreams, earth wheeled abandoned in the hollow gulfs, forgetful of her spirit and her fate. I think we can put a bookmark there and leave ourselves in anticipation of the lines that come next, which we'll read next week. So, namaste. A great joy to have you with us. Stay well. Be beautiful. The good, the true, the beautiful. Be that. Namaste. Jai Ma. Mm.